Hi there, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Mr. Schwank, and welcome to Cleo's Corner U.S. History. So, hooray! The U.S. has sort of won the War of 1812. The Federalist Party was embarrassed by not entirely supporting the war to the point that it was over as a political party, and the United States is entering a period of nationalism that we call the Era of Good Feelings. So today on Cleo's Corner, we are exploring how America emerged as a new nation after our so-called Second Revolution. So one thing you notice is I've got nationalism scrawled all over this page, and nationalism is a complex word, and that oftentimes has taken on a nasty meaning. Although, like most words, it's more about how you use it. Nationalism is just a fancy word for sort of as a national population agreeing to believe in something or to take a certain course of action as a nation. It is seeing an entire population as united, proud of itself, and in agreement about a country's policies and beliefs. The opposite would be like tribalism, where small groups of people, based on a specific characteristic, make decisions that are in their group's best interests only. Used correctly, nationalism is an important part of creating a national identity, shared experiences, and allegiance to a nation that unites a group. Used incorrectly, nationalism can be used to create fear and hatred towards a specific group of people within a nation, or be used as a kind of loyalty check or test to force all people to believe the same thing. Since the colonial period, we have had a reoccurring theme that the American colonies and later states have always operated somewhat independently from each other. Ben Franklin had attempted and failed to effectively unite the colonies in the French and Indian War. The first reaction to independence was to create only a loose confederation of states that could still largely do what they wanted. And Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party was formed in response to what he saw as government taking too much power. At any rate, as we learned in our last episode, the War of 1812 was critical to the development of the United States because the shared experience united the American people in a way not seen since the American Revolution. Desperate losses of failed campaigns and the burning of our new capital, charismatic leaders trouncing on the British in New Orleans, and a plucky defense of Baltimore, resulting in a popular poem becoming our national anthem. All of this led to a sense of national unity and identity and growth in several important parts of our nation. And that's what we're going to jump into today. We're going to start by looking at how the War of 1812 affected the political development of the nation. Almost immediately following the war, President Monroe is elected in an overwhelming majority over Federalist Rufus King. Since really the early days of the Republic, this growing partisan divide had been steadily building up, starting with the political disagreements of Hamilton and Jefferson, the emergence of the Federalist and Democratic Republican parties, the treatment of John Adams as president, the bitterly fought election of 1800, up to the Hartford Convention and talk by Federalists of New England seceding from the United States during the war. The tone of political debate in the United States had continued to become more divisive as we sort of figured out the direction that we wanted to take as a country. With the war successfully concluded and Monroe the new president, the Federalist Party was completely discredited and no longer a viable political party. President Monroe saw this election as a chance to heal the divide, and so he took an extended goodwill tour across the United States, where local towns and cities could celebrate, be proud, and just kind of let off a little steam after the war. Monroe cleverly dressed in his old-fashioned Revolutionary War uniform, and he styled his hair in an older fashion to complete the look and draw the parallel between this victorious feeling after the War of 1812 and the victorious feeling in the American Revolution itself. This all gives Americans a chance to celebrate, and while he could have easily excluded his political rivals in New England, he instead toured across the entire U.S. This gives former Federalists in New England a chance to show their loyalty, and they throw the most lavish parades and evening celebrations. As I've mentioned, the Federalist Party completely collapses, leaving only the Democratic Republicans. They're so powerful, the Democratic Republicans are so powerful, they stop meeting as a party. That means that elections are far less contentious. Only Democratic Republicans run for the party. Literally, the first party system that started with Hamilton and Jefferson collapses under James Monroe and won't reemerge again for about 8 years. So between his two terms, this is when we call, from the 1860 to 1824, maybe a little bit later. That's when we call really the era of good feelings. Okay, so um, just as a last note of just how dedicated Monroe was to trying to heal the divide, after the election, he appoints several former Federalists to key cabinet positions, thus removing any potential point of complaint by others that he was only selecting friends or political allies. This national feeling of unity was also picked up by artists and writers, musicians, as a moment to develop a national American identity, cultural identity. An American style of writing stories set in America and featuring American characters began to emerge. Some of the United States' most beloved and writers and poets, such as James Fenimore Cooper, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Nathaniel Hawthorne, wrote at this moment in American history, and their writings have become American classics. Uh, these authors and poets centered their writings on themes that romanticized or made something sound ideal and perfect. They romanticized life in the wilderness specifically. They made living independently in the woods, taming the wilderness of America without relying on others. They made this uniquely sense and popularized this uniquely American sense of individualism and sort of man versus nature. The freedom to do what you want where on your own piece of land with no one telling you what to do, right? Well, of course, unless you're planning to pack up your family and your entire life and move into the unsettled western territories of Indiana and Illinois, Michigan, Alabama, Mississippi, that romanticized lifestyle was completely fictional. It did, however, inspire many people to do just that, and it created the foundation of what we might call today the American dream. Artists too got in on the trend and created the Hudson River School of Art, which focused on landscapes that idealized the American land and also the need to tame them. They often were focused on a single or maybe a small group of men in the scene, kind of surveying the best way to move in and tame the wilderness, right? Um, One of the most important cultural developments in the early 1800s was the development of Noah Webster's dictionary. Noah Webster was sort of America's premier notable educators, and after the war had created his blueback speller for children shortly after the Revolution. But It was around this time that he publishes what eventually becomes Webster's Dictionary, which still exists today. And it was really seen as an effort to create a distinct American form of English that is different from British English, right? So there was again sort of this focus on creating a unique American identity. Meanwhile, with only one political party in charge, there was broad agreement about the direction of federal power and the growth of the government. Despite Democratic Republicans, origin as a party that stood against strong government, now that they stood victorious as the only national party, applying federal power seemed significantly easier to them. In two very important court cases, Chief Justice Marshall slowly increased the supremacy of the federal government and making it clear that the federal government holds greater authority than the states. Notably, in McCulloch v. Maryland, the state of Maryland tried to tax the Federal Bank of the United States, and Marshall held that states cannot interfere with federal agencies. Providing that sort of that belief that the federal agency has greater authority than the state agency. In Gibbons v. Ogden, federal power was also increased to allow the federal government to regulate interstate trade and also to assist the growing economy, the growing American economy, and help the American government take a more active role in the development of the nation. What's interesting is, you have Marshall, who is the last kind of true Federalist in government service, appointed by Washington himself, who is able to achieve through the court an expansion of federal power, what Federalists had been unable to achieve in the White House in the early days of the Republic. So, sort of finally, and maybe the most important, we need to say a word about economics during the era of good feelings. Thanks to sort of romanticizing the romanticizing of life in the woods and ultimately the crushing of natives during the War of 1812, there is a massive migration westward at this time. Meanwhile, in the South, you have General Jackson, who is continuing to sort of harass and bring the war to natives that remain in the South. And this is a really particularly interesting story. After the Creek War, many of the native refugees, the Creek and the Choctaw, they simply flee over the border into what we would call the Florida Panhandle, where they merged with local Seminole Indians. Florida, of course, was largely uninhabited, and it seemed to change hands between the British and the Spanish relatively quickly. Either way, it was not American territory, and slavery was illegal. So the Panhandle became a very tempting and close ticket to freedom for many enslaved Africans in America. Many of these African slaves also made their way to freedom in Florida. Many African slaves who made their way to freedom in Florida would also join the Seminoles and become what were called Black Seminoles. From there, these refugees would make raids on American plantations in Alabama, Mississippi. Then they would take food, supplies, and they would free more slaves. Well, Jackson's not going to have any of that. And with the closest Spanish garrison being Pensacola, some 60 miles away, Jackson may have been tempted to make some cross-border raids of his own. Now, during the War of 1812, the British had set up a series of fortifications at strategic points along the Florida Panhandle. The British had good relations with these natives because obviously they don't like the Americans either, and also the escaped slaves. So when the forts were abandoned after the War of 1812, the British were, trying to get a little revenge or a little, uh, you know, twist the tail of the Americans a little bit, and so they would simply hand over these fully stocked and armed forts to the Seminole Indians, giving them all kinds of weapons and gunpowder and even cannon. Um, the Of these British forts, or I should say, one of these British forts attracted, hundreds of families, and they created for themselves a successful working community on the banks of what's called the Apalachicola River. So the Americans, of course, have this southern border that they have to protect, and so they create a new fort called Fort Scott, just upriver on a piece of the Apalachicola called the Flint River. But anyway, all of the supplies for this new United U.S. fort had to come up the Apalachicola River, and it passed this well established big settlement of Indians and escaped slaves. So, as the supplies are approaching, some U.S. soldiers were out gathering water when they are fired upon by the settlement. It killed three of the soldiers. It captured one of them, who was reportedly burned alive afterwards, um, and one of them escaped. Well, this is all the provocation that Jackson needs. He marches his troop overland, and he sent a few warships downriver to attack and eliminate the village. When the riverboats arrived at the fort, they anchored and they started firing cannonballs into the fort to gauge the distance. When they were satisfied that they had the right distance, they changed over to what is called hot shot, or cannonballs that have been heated in a furnace. And when these were shot out of the cannon, they would spark fires wherever they landed inside the fort. So, as the entire population of this settlement takes shelter inside the fort, the riverboat shoots its first hot shot into the fort. And in a 1 in a million shot, the first uh, shot of hot shot goes directly into the powder magazine, igniting the fort's entire supply of gunpowder, which was about 500 barrels of gunpowder, instantly killing 270 men, women, and children. It was a massive disaster. It was a horrible, horrible moment. Um, with where it didn't have to happen. But the explosion is so loud that the Spanish in Pensacola were able to hear it, and they sent men to investigate, wondering, what's going on. The event has been called the deadliest cannon shot in U.S. history. It marks the beginning of Jackson's conquest of Florida and what's called the First Seminole War. Ultimately, a new American fort was built on top of the remains of the old British fort, and it was renamed Fort Gadsden after the young lieutenant who was tasked with building it. So, just a sort of a personal story. My parents own a home on St. George Island, which is at the mouth of the Apalachicola River. And so when I was researching some of this a few years ago, and I ran across this story and that it was on the banks of the Apalachicola River, I was very intrigued. And so I dug a little bit deeper and realized that I have probably driven past this fort multiple times on my way down to visit my parents. And so the last time I was there, or the next time I was down there, we took a day trip. My dad, my son, and I went to go see if we could find Fort Gadsden, and this is what we found. You can see the river kind of off to the right there. You're looking down river. It's my son in the picture there. But you can, and my dad way off in the middle of the fort. Now, the British fort was huge. It was this entire area along this whole tree line. It was much larger than the American fort. And the American fort's pretty large to begin with. It's all this raised area here. If I go a little closer, you can see it a little bit better from a distance. These two uh, boilers here are from a steamboat that sank in the Apalachicola River in the late 1800s and were dredged out and saved. But this whole area right here would have been the berm, and so you picture then a wooden palisade sitting on top of these berms right here. I'm standing on one of the berms right here. This would have been the inside of the fort, the outside of the fort, and it doesn't really look quite all that impressive just from this shot, but really that's about a 6-foot drop there, and it's fairly steep off of both ends. It was a pretty sizable fortification. This is me looking on the inside. There's my dad. There's my son. Hi, son. Hi, dad. You're famous. And where he was sitting or getting ready to sit, there were actually I can't remember, 2 or 3 gun emplacements right there that would have been shooting at the gunboats. But the gunboats would have been parked just right out here on the river. I mean, you can almost picture them right out here on the river. And but the Indians and the slaves, the former slaves, they don't have any real experience shooting cannon, and so they were trying to shoot at the gunboats and not really having much success at it. And the whole time, you've got the Americans sitting right out here shooting into the fort. This would be from standing where those cannon emplacements were, looking back into the fort, and you had buildings here. It wasn't just like this. There were actual barracks sitting right over here, and an officers building, and associated buildings along with the fort, and a parade ground, and the whole 9 yards. And if you look really carefully through the back, you can see this you can see where my mouse is there, this post right there. We're going to go back there in a second. That would have been where the powder magazine was. So at the back of the fort, the back side of the fort, that's where the powder magazine was. And so this cannonball sails over this area and lands right in the middle of that powder magazine. And that's where it is. So the later, years later, they do some archaeological digs in this area, and they put these wooden posts right back here that marked the outline of the powder magazine. So imagine stacking this entire area full of 500 barrels of gunpowder, and then lighting it on fire. I mean, it would have simply flattened everything around here. It destroyed the village that would have been back here in the tree line. It destroyed everything, behind where I'm taking this picture, and just instantly killed so many people, 270 some odd people. The writing of it says that you can imagine what it would have looked like walking into this fort, because then the fort still had to be brought in, and I mean, you still had to take soldiers into the fort to basically put the wounded out of their misery. They went in, they found the leaders of the village. One African former slave was executed. The Indian leader was given over to some allied Indians who scalped him and killed him. It was not a very pleasant sight. The gravity of this place, when I was walking through, you could absolutely tell that this was a place that had seen a tragic event, and not only because there were only three of us around, but it was a very quiet, very somber sort of place. And you realized that you were walking on ground where something really tragic had happened. As you can see in the middle here, in I guess typical kind of whitewashing of history, they make no mention of the events here, only that it was a British post and that that an engagement had taken place here between some Indians, and never once was it ever mentioned the ethnicity of the people. Never once was it mentioned never once is it mentioned that at the time Jackson referred to this fort as Negro Fort. And so they make no mention of the fact that there were freed slaves here, or that the survivors were also taken back into slavery, after everything was cleaned up. And so interesting side story and whatnot. But at any rate, Jackson's incursion into Florida was technically a declaration of war against Spain. So luckily, the Spanish were willing to sign the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1822, which allowed the United States to purchase Florida from the Spanish. And so now you have, the right here at the tip of this little peninsula in Florida. That's where the Apalachicola River is. And so kind of right in the middle, right where my pointer is, that's where Fort Gadsden is today. And so now you really have, all the European powers out of, at least the eastern half of the United States, right? And we now own Florida. Another important development during the era of good feelings was the proclamation of the Monroe Doctrine, warning European nations to stay out of the Americas, or the United States would, I don't know, like fight over a Caribbean island. I don't know. So that went over so well in 1812. The Europeans, for their part, were interested in matters closer to home in Europe, and were not terribly concerned about whatever was happening on our side of the Atlantic. It did, however, establish a precedent that the Americas were off limits to future European colonialism. So finally, the era of good feeling was also an important moment in American industrial growth, and really getting into the economic side of this section. What will later be called the market revolution really changes how Americans felt about their jobs. Before the War of 1812, Americans, worked on small family farms that largely only met your personal needs. There was a sense of the Jeffersonian model of a yeoman farmer, that really just simply lived off of the land in a very agricultural sort of lifestyle. That shifts in the era of good feelings, and Americans start to think about how to make lots of products and selling them both nationally and internationally. At the time, Americans west of the Appalachians used the rivers kind of like one-way superhighways to get products down the Ohio to the Mississippi, out the Gulf of Mexico, and then around Florida, and really kind of destined for markets either in the Caribbean or in cities like New York and Boston. That takes a lot of time to go from Indiana uh, down the Ohio, down the Mississippi, around the Gulf of Mexico and Florida, and then back up the East Coast. And yet it was still less expensive and quicker than carting it all over the mountains. This changes in the 1800s with Henry Clay's American system. This economic plan was developed by Henry Clay to grow the American economy. If you remember, Henry Clay was a Speaker of the House. He was one of the primary war hawks who wanted to see the War of 1812 happen. And it's important to realize that, one of the first really big political beefs between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans had been over the national bank. Jefferson hates the idea of the national bank, and as Jefferson's protege, Madison had allowed the charter of the first bank of the United States to expire without renewing it. Congress, though, realizes how important the bank was to regulating the economy, and they authorized the creation of the equally creatively named bank, the Second National Bank of America. The North really thought this was a great idea, although the South was far less thrilled. To add to that, Congress passed protective tariffs to maintain high prices for American goods, which supported New England factories, but it hurt Southern farmers. These two events will sow the seeds for the end of the era of good feelings, but that's a different episode. Factories saw a massive growth during the era of good feelings, and that also changed how people felt about their jobs. Traditionally, an entire community might specialize in producing a few resources by the entire community. This was called a cottage industry, with each member of the town taking a part of the process and then kind of selling it to the next person in the process until the good was finished. Much of this work is done by children and women while the men were out farming their fields. Instead of keeping the workers in their homes and passing the product around, the factory system flipped the process on its head. Now the product would stay in one place and the workers would come to it. In this way, large numbers of workers could accomplish much more in a shorter period of time. To keep the factory powered, many factories of the era were located alongside a river or water source. This allowed a water wheel to power an axle basically nonstop, and by using a series of belts, would keep the machinery moving um, uh, 24 hours a day. Now, with a need for more workers, people began moving towards cities and factory centers. Also, immigration increased. Um, but many of these workers were young, unwed women, which also in turn gave them the first limited taste of independence from their families who were still back home on the farm. Unfortunately for them, their wages were sent back home to their fathers because that's 1800s and women. And the view on women in the 1800s. These economic improvements could not have happened without significant investment in American infrastructure. The national government and private entrepreneurs started creating new roads across the mountains and through the western parts of the United States. The most famous of these is the National Road, which still exists today. It's just called US 40, just north of us, actually, through Indianapolis. Also, roads were quite varied compared to today. Today, you've got basically gravel or asphalt, and back then you would have seen more different types. Roads might have been simple dirt or possibly cobblestoned in short stretches, but more commonly you might find a QuarterE road, which was created by embedding the full-on trunks of trees or half of a tree um, perpendicular to the road, then filling in the gaps with dirt. The effect would have been similar to, but far worse than, driving over the rumble strip in a road, in a modern road. But it was better than the deep ruts and mud found on basic dirt roads. You wouldn't get nearly as stuck, right? But the best roads of the era were plank roads, which were milled lumber built into a roadway like a massive, never ending front porch. These are labor intensive to make and expensive to build, but they also provided the best, smoothest, and fastest way to travel. Often these were toll roads, meaning one person using the road would have to pay a fee to use it. The fee would then be used to pay for repairs, extending the road, and profit for the investors. Additionally, canals were created as an alternative to moving products quickly between locations. In New York in the 1820s, they opened up the Erie Canal, which links the Great Lakes to New York City. The new transportation corridor led to more cities and opportunities growing. In areas where canals were not feasible, railroads were developed. Quickly, the United States created multiple methods of transporting goods easily and quickly. Add into the mix steamboats that allow ships to move up rivers and telegraphs to send messages quickly, and the American economy started booming. This only multiplied the sense of national unity and good feelings. The American system helped the West and the North, but alienated the South, which had invested heavily in slave labor and had little need or use for factories. Suddenly, the South looked like it was progressing much slower than the rest of the U.S. The seeds of our next great conflict were thus planted. Thanks for joining. See you next week.